So most of the conversation out there around bias is negative. And I'm not saying that biases are good, but I'm also saying that they're not bad.
Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where we feature top leaders on how they measure success in their business and life. Now, let's learn from their experiences.
Carl J. Cox here. I'm the host of the Measure Success podcast, where I talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. This episode is brought to you by 40 Strategy. 40 Strategy is built to make strategy work for small to medium-sized businesses and organizations by helping them designing world-class strategic plans, but more importantly, helping them actually get it done. To learn more, go to 40strategy.com. We also have had our book come out, Lost at CEO, Amazon bestseller. Encourage you to go out on Amazon.com, but we are also in a limited time offering a free signed book. So literally, if you send me an email at carljcox@40strategy.com, I will actually send you a free signed copy of the book. So please take advantage of that and look forward to hearing. My only ask in return is please do an Amazon review. So if you're willing to do that, I'm willing to send you a free book and we'll go from there. Well, I'm really excited to have a repeat guest. And thank you to Lisa Schwartz, the CEO of Mathematica, for giving us this recommendation for Sheldon Bernard. Sheldon and I had a wonderful conversation. He's already repping our gear as our podcast get 40 Strategy or Measure Success podcast gear. Sheldon, thanks for repping that. He is the founder of A440 Management. It's a pioneer in applied decision sciences. And we're going to focus on that today to begin with once we start kicking off. He specializes in confronting complex issues and uncertainty, and he's pioneered the direct framework to enable organizations to make better decisions under uncertainty. He's had a load of experience, 15 years plus experience leading special projects for Fortune 100 executives. He himself has helped lead these teams. He's helped launch the company, and he helps this other concept that he's done is rethinking uncertainty. Which is so challenging, right? We think we have all the facts, but we don't. And so then how do you help make sure you still make a decision going forward without knowing everything? And Sheldon's going to help describe that beforehand. He also has an MBA from UNC, Chapel Hill, and he has a certificate of strategic decision and risk management from Stanford. Sheldon, welcome again. Welcome back as a guest to the Measure Success podcast.
It's great to be back with you, Carl. We had so much fun last time. I think we'll be more disciplined and make sure we get through everything that's going to be useful for your listeners.
It was such a good call. We were like, oh, we got to keep talking because we got to have another podcast. It was super fun. We're going to start right out here, though, with something we talked about beforehand is help people out with this algorithm of decision science. Talk us through that.
Decision science is interesting because you've got a bunch of different disciplines that come together with the goal of helping you become a better decision maker. What's unique about us is when I got introduced to this, there were certain schools of thought and different ways of looking at it. And I was naive enough not realize that, there was this sort of garrison set up in the industry between people who did the descriptive work, people who did the normative stuff, the mathematicians, statisticians. And so for me, it really became a study of all of it and an obsession. So what's unique about us is we don't really see any distinction between the behavioral science, the statistical methods, the philosophical arm, and the economics. So A440 blends them all. And in doing that, what we realized is that there is a process, if you will. There's an algorithm. There are rules to doing this that are fairly simple. So that's basically, no matter what I do or what we help organizations with, that's the blueprint that we actually use. So let me maybe walk you through it, and then we can kind of talk about each of the elements. So the first thing when it comes to making a decision under uncertainty is the one that's the least popular. And that's orienting yourself to the fact that you are biased. This is usually where it begins for me and where, eyebrows get raised and people want to move past this part. Every single one of us is biased. Now, here's the thing. Biases are not bad. Like, they are necessary part of human flourishing and fulfillment. Like, you don't want to be analyzing, should I get a pepperoni pizza or a mushroom pizza? Right? You don't want to be pulling out a spreadsheet for that kind of stuff. You want to actually use a bias or some heuristic, some rule of thumb or habit in order to get there. And so I'm not one of the people that says, oh, heuristics and bias is the problem. It's the problem in certain circumstances, and it's especially an issue when you're trying to make a decision under uncertainty. And woe to you if you've got to make that decision with other people. There's more than one decision maker. Now you got all these heuristics and preferences and biases of all these different people trying to work together to get one or to achieve one goal. And so that's the orientation. That's the foundation. So A for 40, if you will, and direct stands on the principle of we are all biased. And it's not helpful to ignore it. Let's address it. So that's one of the things that's very different. So that's kind of the foundation. Right? So you can almost picture a building and it's got 6 apartments and a roof. And that foundation of that building is what I call rational from irrational. We have to orient ourselves that we are trying to get rational thinking from irrational people. And it's helpful. The client recently told me, yeah, we all kind of know this is true, but you helping us have a language to kind of call it out and address it when we're working through strategy development, or working through some special situation is really, really helpful. Does that make sense? That's like literally the most important part.
No, I do. And I'm curious just for a moment, right? Because you said something really interesting there. There's bias, but people will roll their eyes, right? And often they go straight to people bias, right? As an example, as opposed to like their decision bias, right? So they get almost defensive when they hear something like this. It's like, oh, I'm not biased, right? You know, it's almost they pull back. How do you help relax people that it's you mentioned something there. I love the pizza analogy you said. And by the way, mine's Hawaiian if you're with me, or a good New York style cheese pizza. Sorry, little side note there. But
Yeah.
help me understand, right? How do you help people be comfortable with that? They have to get over this, right? They have to get over the bias. Otherwise, they will be making a decision based on their past and not being open-minded to what should they be thinking about in the future.
And that is the trick. And I think you kind of alluded to part of the issue is when you hear bias, you immediately think negative or something that it should not have. And you can understand why, because most of the conversation around bias today is in the area of recruiting, hiring, especially in the business context, having prejudices, pattern matching, hiring in Silicon Valley, you name it. So most of the conversation out there around bias is negative. And I'm not saying that biases are good, but I'm also saying that they're not bad. But truly, bias has way more to do with what's the mechanism, what's the mental mechanics that your brain is using that's resulting in some outcome that leans a little one way or the other. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. So the first thing that we have to do is kind of address this and explain to clients, like when I say bias, this is what we're talking about. And we will actually spend more time a level up from the bias, and we'll talk about the heuristic. There are rules of thumb that your brain uses. We abide by sort of something called the 2 systems method for thinking. Like you kind of have a system 1 and a system 2. And system 1 is very knee-jerk, automatic, quick. It addresses things, right? And that's where a lot of these biases actually start to work. They're working at that level. Your system 2 is slower, it's deliberate, it's lazy. It's not going to jump into the fight unless it has to, but it's the thing that's going to let you calculate and do more thoughtful deliberation. So we basically have to say what we're trying to do when we're making a strategic decision is recognize that because you're a leader, right, and you're making decisions every day, you've got rules of thumb at play here that don't fit this particular situation. You got to recognize them, and we've got to pause. Right. So you do have a bias. You're going to have a bias for, if I lay out 5 strategic choices, the one that looks closest to the thing that you're really comfortable doing, you're going to weight it. You're either going to weight it heavily as the thing you should do, depending on how risk averse you are, or you're going to overweight it as, oh, we need to shake things up. Let me not do that. Right. So that's bias. So that's kind of the first thing that I'm finding I have to address is, we've got to contextualize what we mean by bias and just help people understand it's the heuristic. It's that mechanism that gives you the rule of thumb. And guess what? Those rule of thumbs, they work well 90% of the time, maybe 80% of the time, right? But for this particular situation, this strategic decision you've got to make, we need to turn them things off.
I want to just give an example, I think that fits here properly, because once again, I think so many people literally they hear this and they get biased in hearing it. right? And they're like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. But let me just give you like a real legitimate business example. I was working with a company. We grew 3.5 times in 5 years. It was an awesome growth rate, but we were stuck for a moment
Mm.
because a competitor had the audacity to charge only $50 per installation as opposed to the market rate of 350. Okay. What we were missing was they were looking at the total cost of the product plus the implementation as a total dollar amount. Well, we were fixated on our price has to be the same. It was an integrity issue. And so I literally put up on a board and whiteboard and like whiteboarded this all out and said, by making this decision, we just gave our competition $350,000. And my CEO at the time, wonderful man, actually best mentor I ever had, taught me strategy. Like literally was the first person who really teach me strategy. But he was biased. He was biased. As a matter of fact, he called me out and said, Carl, you're a used car salesperson. He was so mad that I called out this fact that we were biased towards keeping our pricing, which was lost us and gave the competition $350,000. After that really tough conversation, we changed our methodologies because we recognized to play in this bigger game that we were in, we had to change our thinking of the total cost of ownership from the client's perspective, not from our perspective. But that's a great example where bias can hold us back from making great decisions, right? Because we're caught back in what we think is right or wrong.
That's a really interesting example because you had a couple of things going on there. You had some mental accounting, like we're thinking about these things in buckets as opposed to like true economic value. So it's pricing, and it's like, who cares about pricing? Like, what's the total value that's being lost or gained here? And then this escalation of commitment of like, we're on this path and we're digging in our heels. Yeah, so that's perfect, right? So there are a handful of heuristics that combine that produce all of those weird things that you just mentioned. And so that's where it starts. That's where direct starts. And as a matter of fact, everything within direct is taking into account that you're trying to overcome those heuristics, right? So then the next place we go from there is defining the frame of the decision. And there's a couple of things I would say about this one. The first is within the Society of Decision Professionals, of which I'm a member, and I've held a committee role for a few years, something called a knowledge sharing committee, which is cool because I get to see sort of where all the practitioner thought is, and we kind of curate something called the Decisionpedia, which is a library of everything. In that role, gosh, I don't remember how many years I've been in there. I get to talk to a lot of the folks who've been doing this for 30, 40 years. And it's a very broad consensus that conservatively, about 80% of decisions fail because they don't have the right frame. The teams aren't working on the same problem. They think they are, and maybe at some high level they are, but as soon as you start asking specific questions and getting people to, in an unencumbered way, state, what do you think the problem is? What do you think the problem is? And put that before people, there's usually a framing problem. And if you think about that one, why it's such a big deal is, I'm going to walk through the rest of direct, and you can survive botching a couple of those, but it's very rare that you can survive a whole team working on the wrong problem or working on different problems. That usually hurts you quite a bit. So that's sort of the D in direct, right? Is deciding that decision frame, right? So we have tools and like facilitative techniques and templates that I use to flush that out. But it begins with something that we call WRGOH, WRGOH. What's really going on here? What's really going on? Because you know this, Carl, if you step in with especially the larger they get, a mid-sized company, you can kind of tell as the outside person is, there's some things in the background that are not being said, they're not being flushed out, right?
So many times. I mean, that what you say that just is it's laughable, right? It's why the importance of bringing in somebody from the outside, right?
Yeah.
Because internally you're not willing to go there. You're not willing to talk about, if you may, the elephant in the room, right? Or the mouse in the room, or whatever you want to call it. But you're not willing to talk about the thing that's really holding you back. And somebody from the outside. And what's interesting is I find surprisingly, it's not always the bad guy CEO. It's often the CEO is not willing to say something they need to say, right? They're not willing to call out somebody on their team because they don't want to offend them, or they don't want to upset them, or they don't know the right way how to do it, or they know there was a challenge in an area and they just don't know how to overcome it. So yeah, that elephant, that the reality of not solving the right problem, right? The people, process, the systems, which one of them are broken, and sometimes we're trying to fix it's just like we're trying to fix the wrong thing, and it's sitting right in front of us.
Yeah. So that's the D. I is to identify and interrogate your values. Also, surprisingly not done, right? I'll step into an engagement and they'll say, we're trying to decide between a bunch of options, right? And we're going to get there in a second about the options. So let's assume that we have addressed with that team that, okay, you're standing on a foundation where there's going to be bias at play here and we've got to deal with it. And then we've defined the frame of the decision. So we know what's really going on, it's out on the table, and we know what we're doing and why. And we got a good sense of about how would you know that we're actually working on the right thing. The next thing is going to be, you need to acknowledge some sort of a value architecture by which you would be able to decide between options, right? So is it revenue? Is it profit? Is it market share? Is it employee engagement, right? Is it something else? How do you measure success? And the flip side of that is, in the work that I do, I get pulled more and more into things that are special situations or crisis. There's usually some trade-off that the company has to make between flexibility, profit, and volatility. And if you're good, you can optimize two of those three, but at the expense of the third. So we have to have.
What were those three again? Can you name those again? What were those three things that you
There's a more complicated, I'm trying to remove all the jargon, but think of it as like flexibility, like your ability to like, whoa, let me stop and do something different. So flexibility, profitability, return on investment, think of it that way. And then volatility, risk, right? How much could performance bounce around? So it's usually given like.
No. Thank you. I apologize for interrupting, but I love it how it's rare that you're trying to get two of three, right? So many times I ran into like, oh, we want to solve all of it. It's like,
Yeah, right.
well, no, it's actually competing. It's competing with what you're doing, right? And so you have to be willing to let something go. I'll go back to that pricing situation I talked about. He had to be willing to let go of his pricing belief that pricing always had to be the same. He had to take a risk, a volatility risk, that they would have different type of pricing for different type of deals. That was breaking his integrity formula, right? And he, of all the salespeople out there, was like, oh, I don't want them to be doing different things because we're going to be like, once again, the term he used was a used car salesperson. I don't want to be that. It's just so I love this, once again, what you're trying to get to. But once again, you can't solve it all, right? Because like literally the profitability equation and that same thing, by definition, your profit percentage goes down, but what went up? Your gross margin dollars. Your gross margin dollar, like they couldn't get the large gross margin deals because they weren't willing to change their price. They weren't willing to put risk in the formula of bidding. Once they overcame that, they made more money. But until that, that was a right. It was competing. They literally those two things were competing against each other.
Yeah, great example. And unfortunately, that happens more often than you think. Quite a bit. I see it all the time. And if you want a strategy that's very safe and gives you, I don't know, the ability to come in and out, you're not going to get huge returns off of it, right? So you can pick any two. Most of the time, you're going to get one. You'll optimize around one. Where I think we help is helping organizations figure out how to optimize too, and then figure out where their right trade-offs are. So that's the I. You got to identify, and then you got to interrogate those values. So we've got to get into what is it you want. We've talked about the problem. What is it you want? What are you willing to give up? And that's got to be described with clarity, right? Because in a lot of my work, we'll end up building some pretty sophisticated financial models and some mathematical models, and we use simulation for everything. Because when you're dealing with uncertainties, for most complex or special situations, it's not really appropriate to represent that with a number. So we have to get the company to clarify these things well enough that we can actually translate it into a model. But then there's a lot of times where I'm facilitating and there's no modeling needed. You can literally just draw a little decision tree on a whiteboard and get there. But you've still got to go through the process of saying, what do I want? What am I willing to give up? That's the I. Then the R is you got to rethink your options. This is the other place where there seems to be a lot of issues. Like the first one is around the framing, and people just assume that they're working on the right problem. We've got to go back and find the frame. The next place where things fall apart pretty consistently is in this issue of options and alternatives. What's really available to you? Most of the time, the work I see that I'm involved in, the set of alternatives considered is just too narrow, or they're too similar. They don't really cover the entire decision space. And this is one of those things that's really hard to survive because no choice that you make is better than the set of alternatives that you consider, right? It's a limiting factor. And I've done in my speaking engagements, I will both speak and then also use it as an opportunity to learn from the audience. So we'll do live polling, been collecting data now for years. And about 20% of participants say that they have, at the time that they're going to make a decision, three good, compelling alternatives to choose from, right? You usually get something that's in the literature known as the decoy effect, right? You're the CEO and somebody in the team says, okay, here's what we could do. We could do this or this other thing or nothing, right? Nothing isn't really, I wouldn't say it's not viable, but you're asking for alternatives. So yes, nothing's alternative. And then what usually happens is the other two, one of them is what's known as a decoy. It's terrible. It's really only there to make the thing the team wants to do look better. So those are not compelling alternatives. I tell clients the way that you know that you're going to have at least three compelling alternatives, if you can look at the set of alternatives that your organization, your team have put before you and kind of know which one is the best, you've been hoodwinked. Those are not compelling alternatives. It's a trap. As they say in Star Wars, right? It's a trap.
There are no droids in the building. It is just I love that this reality of, oh, we can do this or this, right? And then that is a terrible, it's literally a terrible call,
Oh,
right? And so it's just intended, right, to go back to kind of biased and towards the one decision we should make, right? And it is crazy. I love though that, and so what you're saying is that only 20%. So the other 80% are just doing one or the nothing, or what is?
one.
Oh wow, just
Yeah.
literally one. So literally 80% have just one other thing, and in most cases, it's a joke.
Yeah.
Or like
The-
like literally they've only given one option. You're saying they literally only come up
right.
with one option.
And it's
Oh wow.
usually a false dichotomy. It's this or nothing. Like, no, you've got more options than that. You've got a lot more options. Right. So that's rethinking your options. The next thing is expressing your model. And at least in strategic decision making under uncertainty, what we know from the literature and the neurosciences, those kind of choices are made with a mental model. You've got some structure of how the pieces fit together in your mind. You're the CEO, you do, the CFO does, your head of audit does, your head of marketing, your head of sales, your chief operating officer, right? As a team, you've got mental models of how things come together. And when you're trying to make a choice that is in the world of a special situation, it's highly uncertain. They're not choices you make all the time. They have consequences, either immediate consequences or they constrain your choices in the future. You shouldn't take for granted that you all have the exact same mental model, how it works. Yes, we can all look at a P&L, but the drivers and how we think things impact that P&L are not necessarily going to be the same, right? And most strategic decisions are made on the margin. So that's really the next piece is express the model. Your team as a decision maker needs to know how the pieces fit together. They need to have transparency to your model. And vice versa. If you're expecting them to execute and you've got a different mental model than they do, you're gonna have a problem, right? So that's the very helpful in the work I do because we'll take that a step further and actually convert that into an actual model. Say, all right, this is all the pieces and how they fit together. People get to weigh in. And now it's not a black box modeling exercise because I'm just translating what you all as a leadership team have told me is the structure of how things work.
One of the things I want to say here too, for those who are listening or just catching or we're halfway paying attention to what's been said, is you are working with some of the smartest people in the world. I mean, you're working with some of the top business minds, Fortune 100 plus companies, billions of dollars in revenue in many cases,
And some NGOs too.
and this is still going on. One decision, right? One option, no model, right? Bias. Isn't that fascinating, right? Of like, here we why the part of, we primarily work with small to medium sized businesses, and I just want to help you relax if you have a small to medium sized business, that the best companies in the world, the reality, right, of what we do applies to small, medium, and big,
Oh, yeah.
It's just kind of where we've normally been and learning how to talk the talk in terms of the audience that you're with. But it's fascinating, right? Regardless of the degrees, regardless of the company, regardless of where it's traded in the NYSE or NASDAQ, or whether they're a privately held company, the same framework is still happening, regardless of your degree.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, and we are all human. And I think what happens, and when I was on the inside, running think tanks for these big companies in the corporate strategy office, you almost assume that because you're part of this big successful machine, that bias isn't a real thing. And sure, we're always objective, and oh, sure, we're thinking about our alternatives, but there's a lot of positioning that's happening. There's a lot of advocacy for certain paths forward. There's a lot of, I can say it now, there's a lot of fear about, okay, I think we're all working the same problem, but the last thing I want to go back and do is go ask the CFO, hey, what did you mean by we need to do X, Y, and Z? Right. So there's fear of the feedback loop that is required to get the clarity that you need, because it can be career limiting. And so it's not a lack of an intellect or even desire. I mean, there's some structural things that I think cause these things to happen when you get to Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies. But you're right, the same behavior manifests, and we're human. We're always going to be human. That's why we start there. That's why it's the foundation.
I love that last statement you talk about, is fear of getting clarity. And I can see that. I've been in that situation myself. I've been in a meeting and you're afraid to ask a question, right? To clearly identify and understand what's actually happening and taking place. But this, once again, happens at all levels, right? Where, what some of the differences, right? And it's a lot of times the difference in large and small companies is pay, right? And in volume, right? But a lot of the minutia is just it's a volume difference, right? And so, but you can have half people making wonderful comps, right? $300,000 to $500,000, $1 million, depending on their situation, way more, right? And they're still afraid to ask a question for clarity. And they might be making a decision where there's hundreds of millions, perhaps even at times $1 billion, right? Plus of investment. And they're unwilling to ask a clarifying question because they feel like they're going to look bad, right? Crazy. I mean, it's just fascinating to me, right? Of these things that's like why their own fear of losing their own position, when if we had the bias of, hey, I'm asking a question to understand more, to make sure I have this right, but we're unwilling to do it. I think that's just super fascinating.
It is. And in the large, really well-run companies, I've noticed that people who accelerate through the ranks quickly do exactly that. They're the person who asks the question. They're very smart about how they ask it to get that clarity, and not as worried about seeming credible as in being effective. There's an art and science to it, and you do learn that in really large, well-run companies. Okay, so where did we stop?
Where ELAS, so it's the C, I think.
Yeah, so the C is collating information. So here it's survivable, but it's also very unpopular. And so I'll just go ahead and say it. When you're talking about decision making under uncertainty, information that doesn't have the ability to change a decision is useless. It has zero value. That's very hard in projects where teams are used to going out and getting a whole bunch, or they're used to doing a large market test. Well, okay, if you got all of this data, you will quote unquote learn more. Can it change your decision? And I usually get a sheepish, well, no, don't go collect the data, right? There is a time and a space for you to do analysis that helps you get clear about the accounting implications of a choice, the true costs of the decision, or a myriad of other things. Maybe there's a level of detail that's required according to policy or audit standard. When we talk about making a strategic choice, the only information that has value is the information that can cause you to change your mind. I found that is very, very difficult for teams and organizations that are used to, we got to go learn a bunch in order to do this strategy. And they like to collect a lot of information. I think there's comfort that people have in collecting lots of information. And so when I say something like, okay, well, in the collation of information, is this going to change your decision? No. And clients know me now. Like, you're going to tell us not to do it, aren't you? Yes, I am. Don't waste the money. So that's the first part of it. And the second part of it is you got to account for uncertainty. Some of the information is going to have to come from your people, whether we want to admit it or not. There's usually someone in the organization or someone in the ecosystem that has the data. They are the data, and you've got to go and get that from them. So how do you do that? Because they're also human and they're going to be biased, right? So there is the application of the science around what we call subject matter elicitation. How do I have a conversation with Carl and represent the uncertainty in what he knows so that we can use it? So that's kind of like collating information.
Fantastic. And thing I learned a long time ago when I was a young CFO, just like you said, get data, get data, get data, get data, get data. But regardless of the data, we still had to make an emotional decision, you know, and that's it's like, okay, let's get all the facts together and then make an emotional decision. We are still human, right? And regardless of everything that we know and all the wisdom, there's still uncertainty in that decision. And there's risk that it might not work. And there's risk that things that may happen that we can't foresee every single time. But having the courage to move forward regardless of some level of uncertainty.
Absolutely. And the last piece is T, tagging signals and triggers. This one came from two places. I actually had to go back to decision theory, back to the roots, and like reconstruct this framework from first principles, because the way that I had learned it and was using before started to fail me really quickly once I had P&L responsibility. So there was a brief period of time as a finance director, and I had strategy and pricing, more than one geography, right? So involved in a lot of decision making, and I have high respect for people who run divisions in corporations. It's really hard. It's 100 choices a week, more emails than you can read. I mean, bless you all. I was miserable, but in that season, I learned that there's almost never an instance where I'm going to make a strategic choice and literally just ignore all the information after. Never. I'm going to come to a fork in the road. I'm going to make a choice. We're going to do something in the market. I have the ability to make other choices based on what I'm seeing. And so it's very important to think about, what are the things, when you make a decision, what are the things that would cause us to change our mind? And how are we going to observe them and track them? What solidified this is I spent some time a year and a half ago with a startup hedge fund, and had spent some time with a few other sort of early stage financial services. And what's interesting about them, before they make a trade, they're already thinking about the exit. And it was like a mind-blowing principle of like, you do need to think about the exit. You need to be thinking about, and right, they would have those that use something called technical analysis. They know when price gets to here and we're seeing these kind of trends, get out, stop the train. And so that's really what the T is, right? So that takes you all the way through direct, right? You're standing on the concept of rational thinking from irrational people. You want to define the frame. You want to identify and interrogate your values. You want to rethink your options. You want to express your model, collate information, and then tag your signals and triggers. You step through this algorithm, it's not going to guarantee you results. Nobody can do that. You need to be omniscient. You need to be able to predict the future. What we can guarantee is that you're going to make a good decision, because what I haven't really said is those steps, right, are consistent with all the principles from actual decision theory. And if you can get around the fact that you can never control an outcome, and recognize that what we're really trying to do is make really good decisions. And if we make good decisions consistently, it's our best insurance policy against bad outcomes, then you're fine, right? It gives you the freedom to know as a leadership team, as a decision maker, with the information we've got, we've made a good choice. And if the outcome starts looking the way that we don't want it to, well, you've tagged your signals and triggers, you're going to know, you're going to see, and you can pivot. So that's direct. That's the algorithm. Hopefully that makes sense and people listening get something out of it.
Yeah, and of course we did it again. I mean, this is for me extraordinarily interesting, right? On how to make decisions, right? And understanding the way, and then recognizing too, once even you made a decision, is what do you do next, right? Is because there is going to be clarity once you start moving forward in a certain direction, right? And then that's going to help provide, I love that, the tagging signals of, hey, let's understand, right? Let's read, understand, and know when to get out, or know when to stop, or know when to increase the momentum or when to decrease the momentum, And so I love that concept. Okay, so we're going to try to nail this down here in 3 minutes. You ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. All right, number one. So how do you measure success in your business?
This one will probably be weird. I've listened to enough of your guests. I'm going to pick something I haven't heard anybody say. I know that we're doing a good job when clients start to pull me into decisions that are out of the scope of what I've been brought in for. And I know where things are going really, really well when they start asking me about applying this to their personal life, because that means that the trust and the approach, the tools in us as a company is at its highest level. And it's a sacred space to be in. So once I start having those conversations, I know we're doing well.
Okay. Habits. And we, of course, we're supposed to have a whole conversation to talk about habits. We'll talk about that another time. But habits, what habits, and I know you have a lot of good habits you've developed. What type of a few of your key habits that you're doing on a consistent basis to make sure you're getting your best?
Yeah, I need to be, I don't know where I got this from, but I feel like I need to be about 5 years ahead of clients in terms of the best thinking in what I'm doing. So I read a lot. As a matter of fact, not only do I read a lot, I approach that reading and studying as if I'm back in graduate school. So there are block times for deep work, and that deep work is me getting very heavy into the science. Are there better modeling approaches? What are the latest open source packages I can play around with to develop better software? So there is a habit and schedule time for research, right? So I guess you could call it R&D, but it's very deliberate, very rigorous. I would highly recommend people reading, I think it's How to Make It Stick. I use those techniques in my learning to make sure I'm absorbing and developing mastery in the topics.
Right, so what was that book again? I want to make sure that'll be your book recommendation. Say that again.
How to Make It Stick.
How to Make It Stick. Yeah.
Peter Brown,
Is
I
that
believe.
Heath? No, okay, that's a different one. Okay, How to Make It Stick. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
He do have a I think they do have a sticking book. And
Yes, yeah, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can drop it in
Yeah.
the show notes. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do that. All right. How do you measure success in your personal life?
Success in personal life, I think this will sound a little bit morbid. I think about at the end of the year, at the end of the season, if I were to die today, what's going to be in my eulogy? If I'm happy with what I think people would say, or the eulogy that's going to be written, that's success.
And I'll say this, and as we get ready to drop off here, that end in mind is truly brilliant. And I've said this multiple times in the podcast, but I've been to too many funerals recently, and no one talks about what they accomplished at work. What they talk about is the impact and the memories that they made with people. That's what's talked about. When people show up, they care about the love, the caring, the impact, how they made them feel. That's what gets talked about. And so here, just to clarify, and I'm a capitalist at heart. I want people to be as successful as possible. I want you to make as much money as you can. I really, truly, but to do great things with and to help make a difference in whatever it is you believe in. And then through that, don't forget the people along the way, because those are the people. That's your eulogy. That's what people are going to be writing about you, right? Is how you help to make a difference in your belief, in your cause, in your future, and then the people around you. Were you making a positive difference? And I love that. I love your answer, because you were basically saying that, keeping your end in mind, right? What are people going to say if it all stops right now? And did I meet that grade of how I wanted to be written? Because it does. It changes your decisions you make on a daily basis when you start thinking that way. Yeah.
Yeah. You and I offline were talking nudges and things on habit. And I will definitely get more time to talk habit, but we had a similar experience with passing of a loved one, I think you and I, and it just reoriented me. And like I came through that, and I just haven't viewed the world, myself, or success or anything the same since then.
There's this crazy belief, right, that we're all going to live to 100 for some reason. Everyone thinks we're going to live to 100, and
Yeah,
I don't know where they get that, but it just all maybe because there's a song about it, right? And it's we just think, oh, we're going to 100, and then of course they think, oh, we're going to have these perfect years through 100, and it's crazy, right? I mean, look at the data, folks. We're talking here with decision science, right? And then you got to look at your own genetics, which you and I have each respectively looked at, and it has completely changed our decision making and how we live today. And people go, how could you be, why are you doing that? Why are you traveling to this? Why are you going to that? Why are you spending money on this? Because I'm living today, folks. I'm living today because you cannot guarantee tomorrow.
Cannot.
And so you want to maximize your conversation. You want to maximize what you're doing. And you want to make a difference with the people that you're with. And so thank you so much. I'm so glad that you got to be on the podcast again. I know we're going to find another way to do this somehow, but we're not going to hold you to it right now because we're both busy individual. But Sheldon, thank you so much for being a guest on the Measure Success podcast again.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I'm glad we could get it done. And we made it. We got through the key questions.
We got it, crushed it. And to everyone else who's listening, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Sheldon is truly one of the most brilliant people that I know. I love it how you talked about you're doing deep work on a consistent basis to continue to learn. And I encourage everyone. That's why we ask all of our guests, what's a book you recommend? Because to be a great leader, you have to be a great reader, as we quote from Zig Ziglar, and you have to continue to learn. And it gives you motivation. It gets you excited. That's why we talk about that. And then keeping the end in mind, that is, I think, wonderful wisdom behind all of this. So, as we like to say to finish out, we wishing you the very best and measuring your success. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Measure Success podcast. We'll see you again next time to learn from the best. Remember to subscribe now to get future episodes.